We are continuing our series on patience. This morning's message is on the patience of Jesus. Last week we looked at cultivating the character of God. Michelle gave a message on Matthew 5, which is a real key text, how God causes the sun to rise on the righteous and the unrighteous and sends rain on the righteous and unrighteous. And she'll come back to that later in this series, but a key text for the early church in terms of the patience of God. And last week, I think Michelle had a couple phrases that I thought we really want to capture as we move forward. One is just that patience is God's unhurried faithfulness. God's unhurried faithfulness. And also, patience is God's indiscriminate generosity towards us. And I thought those two phrases, those are keepers for sure. And so we'll sort of be cultivating that in our hearts as we move forward. Next week, we're going to move on and we're going to look at how patience releases control. In a couple weeks, we'll be looking at how patience is unhurried. And then 3 weeks from now, we'll be looking at how patience is really unconventional. It's countercultural, as it were. So that's just a little bit of a roadmap of where we're going, cultivating patience in our lives and really cultivating a posture of patience as we think about our neighborhoods and our workplaces. We've been thinking a lot about how to be a blessing in our city. And one thing we've been talking about as a leadership team is that it requires a certain type of heart and a certain type of posture to be a blessing in an extremely mobile, transitional, suburban commuter culture. And so we're looking at patience for the next couple of months here. We'll be in Luke 9. Before we get to Luke 9 and John 8, the two passages that we'll be diving into this morning, I've been reflecting this week that we live in a world searching for answers, don't we? We live in a world that's just desperate for answers. I ran across an article that we look at our cell phones 150 times a day right now, on average, 150 times. Most of them for answers of one type or another. What's the weather? What time is it? Looking for a product, looking at a news item, and some of us look at on the high end, what they call like active cell phone users, whatever that means, active cell phone users, 540 times a day. So that's a lot. Google gets 63,000 searches a second right now. There are just probably this month, Google is going to pass the number of searches per month as there are humans on Earth, or searches per day, as there are humans on Earth. So Google's coming up right around 6 billion searches a day, all looking for some kind of information, right? And Google, sort of related to the stuff I shared a couple weeks ago, Google has studied this. People on average will wait 0.4 of a second for Google to give them an answer now. At half a second, people move on to a different type of search. So that's the amount of time people have while we're waiting for answers. And at the same time, I don't know about you, but as I navigate life in the world right now, I feel like the questions are overwhelming. Michelle and I went on a date night a week ago. We have a number of unconventional date nights. Speaking of unconventional, we went to see The Last Men in Aleppo, which is a documentary on the Syrian civil defense. It's possibly a date night idea you could take. That could be your takeaway this morning. If you're feeling pretty happy on your date night and you don't want to be, you could go. But it's a documentary on the incredibly courageous people who stayed behind in Aleppo to rescue and to recover bodies and victims and survivors out of the rubble of the daily and even hourly bombings there. And I thought it was absolutely riveting to see both the pain of people coming out of rubble not alive and families waiting to see whether their relatives were alive or dead, and in many cases finding out they were dead. And at the same time seeing whole buildings collapse. There's a scene right at the beginning of a building collapsing and just digging through rubble with a bulldozer and pulling out a child alive. And this tremendous sense of hope that just rose up even watching it. But I think the image that stuck with me were actually pictures of night bombings. And it just for the next several days was grinding like, God, how is this happening? How do you bomb just a neighborhood? Not a place with militants necessarily, just a neighborhood. How do you cluster bomb a neighborhood? How are people being slaughtered like that? Early this week, we saw a bombing outside of an Ariana Grande concert, and I'm sure many of you saw that and followed that to some extent. And then just a couple days later, a bus carrying 28 Coptic folks in Egypt was blown up, and they were killed, and it was mostly kids. And it just sort of piles up, doesn't it? Just this sense of the questions. I was thinking as we got to Memorial Day weekend, I think Memorial Day weekend in San Diego is pretty much about beaches and barbecues, isn't it? Like the line at Costco was extraordinary. But it started in 1868 as a day to put flowers. It was called Decorations Day. Day to put flowers on the graves of those fallen in the Civil War. It was a day for North and South to grieve. And I just think of the enormous questions that were underneath those first decoration days that they had in 1868 and 1869. Like, what an incredible cost, and how will things ever be put back together again after what we just went through? And in the midst of that, as I read the Gospels, I think very often Jesus comes, he says, I am the way, the truth, and the life, right? But I think sometimes our need, both as a world and as individuals, is actually not even just for answers, but for the patience of God. And I hope you see what I mean this morning. This is a new way of thinking for me, and it might be a surprising or a new way of thinking for you, but I think we desperately need the gentle, the restorative, the patience, the way that Jesus walks with us in our pain and brokenness, the way that Jesus holds on to us in our pain and brokenness. We're going to look at a couple passages this morning. Let's pray. Lord, thanks for your word. And Jesus, thanks that you're incredibly patient. You're incredibly patient. You stay with us. You persevere. And you never give up. You are the same yesterday, today, and forever. And Lord, would you bless this time? Would you pour out on us, Lord? I ask that you would meet each of us just where we're at this morning, and that your lavish generosity would be poured out on each of us. In your name, amen. So let's read Luke 9, perhaps. There we go. And then in a little bit, we'll look at John 8. So we're going to take a big picture view of patience first here in Luke 9, and then we're going to do a kind of a case study in John 8 in just a few minutes. While everyone was amazed at all he was doing, so Jesus had been doing these miracles, they're totally amazed. He said to his disciples, let these words sink into your ears. And I picked the NRSV translation this morning because that's quite literally what it says in the Greek. And I think it's a really interesting phrase. Let these words sink into your ears. You just think of the way water sort of slowly goes down. There's sort of the idea here that they're not going to get it right away. Let these words sink into your ears. The Son of Man is going to be betrayed into human hands. But they did not understand this saying. Its meaning was concealed from them so that they did not perceive it. And I like the way Luke doubles up their sort of the way they're confounded. They didn't get it. And in case you didn't get what I just said, they didn't perceive it. So there's this sort of double emphasis. They did not get what Jesus was talking about. And curiously, if we were reading the whole of chapter 9, 20 verses earlier, he says exactly the same thing. So as the Son of Man's going to be betrayed, and then a little bit later, in case you weren't listening, let these words sink in. I'm going to be betrayed. So there's this posture that Jesus has. He's going to the cross. He's set in that direction, but they're not getting it. And they were afraid to ask him about this saying. And I want to highlight that because something Sterling pointed out in worship is that sometimes we're afraid to come to God. Not like the sort of healthy awe and reverence of God, but sometimes we're afraid to go to God. And the disciples were afraid to go to Jesus. They were afraid to ask him about this. I'm not, positive why, but in a culture where they knew so viscerally what crucifixion and betrayal into Roman hands looked like, I don't know that they wanted to know the answer. Like, surely that's not what being the Messiah means. And what would that mean for us? If that's what being the Messiah means, what does that mean for us? Whatever their reasons, they were afraid to go to him, and I think sometimes we're afraid to go to him, aren't we? Sometimes we're afraid to bring our questions to Jesus. When the days drew near for him to be taken up, he set his face to go to Jerusalem, and he sent messengers ahead of him. And on their way, they entered a village of the Samaritans to make ready for him. But they did not receive him because his face was set toward Jerusalem. And so Samaria is sort of a central region in Israel with a mixed population, an ethnically mixed population, people that were sort of had a partly Jewish ancestry and a partly Assyrian ancestry. They were all sort of mixed up. And they didn't receive them because Jesus was heading towards Jerusalem, and that's not where they worshiped. They had kind of a hybrid faith, and they worshipped on Mount Hermon in the middle of the country, and so they didn't receive Jesus. And when his disciples, James and John, saw it, they said, "Lord, do you want us to command fire to come down from heaven and consume them?" I kind of love that passage. John's really known for love. He wrote the Gospel of John, but it's good to remember that this guy who is so known as being Jesus' beloved and for writing so eloquently on love, started out here. Jesus, I get it. Let's burn him up. He's just right in there with the moral police, isn't he? And sometimes, we have judgmental stuff rise up in us. And I think even on my judgmental days, I don't quite use the fire to come down from heaven normally. But that's their response. And then they went on to another village. And of course, Jesus right after that is not only going to rebuke them, but then he's going to send them out where? To Samaria. So it's kind of like you thought that the plan was to burn these guys up. Actually, the plan is for you to go and to find residence there. That's the passage we've just studied so much over the last 5 years. Luke 10 is right after this. So James and John say, should we burn them up? And then Jesus says, no, go 2 by 2, and you're going to be like lambs among wolves. And I want you to find a person of peace and stay there and then heal the sick. And then they get back from doing that, and Jesus says, hey, I have a story to tell you guys. It's about a good who? Samaritan. And so Jesus is going to press into their bias and their sort of judgmentalism toward the Samaritans. Well, let's walk through this, and I want to look at the big picture for just a few minutes, and then, as I said, a case study. But as we look at this passage, we see the patience of Jesus. We see him really embodying and showing us the patience and the character of God. When we talk about God becoming flesh in Jesus, this is the great sort of revelation of the Gospels. That Jesus is God in the flesh, born of a virgin, growing up, going to the cross on our behalf. When we want to see the character of God, we always look at Jesus. And Jesus is showing us that the character of God is patient. He's steadily, patiently, without complaining, going towards the cross. He's steady when they don't get what he's saying. He's not thrown off by their misunderstanding. He's patient with his disciples when they don't get him. As I said earlier in Luke chapter 9, Jesus had said he was going to be betrayed, and then he says it here, and then he says it 4 more times in the next 5 chapters. Almost every chapter of the middle of Luke, Jesus tells his disciples that he's going to be betrayed. And then we get to this just before that, 2 quotes. So patience is the very nature of God, from Tertullian. And the early church fathers, when they thought about Jesus, they thought about Jesus as the very embodiment of the patient character of God. I think today there's a lot of dialogue around how Jesus embodies love. And I think that many sort of Christians in America, if you just got one sort of character trait for Jesus or one sort of virtue, probably love is where most of us would start. And it's striking to me that we've just been discovering, sort of Michelle and I and a few others who are doing a little digging in early church history. The early church, for the first 4 centuries, their number one association was patience. They really thought the thing that Jesus embodies most, what they called the virtue of virtues, is patience. Here's one more early church quote from Cyprian. By his habitual forbearance, Jesus exemplifies his Father's patience. particularly in going to the cross for us, steadily, slowly as it were, living, healing the sick, but steadily heading towards the cross, steadily laying down his life for a culture that was anything but patient. But as I said, the disciples don't get it. So 6 times Jesus tells them he's going to be betrayed. And then, so here we have Luke 9 one more time. The Son of Man is going to be betrayed into human hands, but they didn't understand this saying. 6 times this gets repeated. And then check out Luke 18. This is pretty marvelous. Jesus took the 12 aside and told them, we're going to Jerusalem, and everything that's written by the prophets about the Son of Man will be fulfilled. He will be delivered over to the Gentiles. They'll mock him, insult him, and spit on him. They will flog him and kill him. And on the 3rd day, he will rise again. But the disciples did not understand any of this. Its meaning was hidden from him, and then the repetition again, and they didn't know what he was talking about. In case you didn't know what didn't understand means. They didn't get it. One of the reasons I love this is because there's a lot of times that I just don't get what God is saying to me. I don't know if you have had that experience or are having that experience, but I think there's times when we just misunderstand God. Or we hear it again and again. For me, one is just, I've had so many conversations with God in prayer around performance not being the thing that God's looking for me. He's just not looking for our success. His love is just not conditional. And yet I feel like I just have that conversation repeatedly. And this is like, I think, a really healthy reminder. The disciples had the same conversation again and again, and they just didn't get it. They were slow. And I hope that we take away this morning that if you're in a place of not getting it, Jesus has patience for that. He's steady. He just repeats it to them. He explains it to them. He draws it out for them. But he's patient when they don't understand. He's also super patient in his mission. When the days drew near for him to be taken up, he set his face to go to Jerusalem. Jesus is patient in his mission. That is to say, he doesn't waver. When the disciples don't get it, he doesn't waver. When the Samaritans reject him, he doesn't waver. When Jerusalem rejects him, he doesn't waver. And when the Samaritans reject him, he doesn't reject Samaria. And I think it's really important to catch that Jesus' sort of embrace of Samaria is much larger than Samaria's embrace of Jesus. They reject him and say, we're not even interested. And Jesus just keeps on going and then sends the disciples. And when the disciples get rejected, Jesus goes to Jerusalem, and then immediately after Jesus is risen from the dead, he sends them back into Samaria. And so this sort of steady rejection from Samaria doesn't sort of dissuade Jesus from pressing in. And you know what? I think that's good news. If any of you have been in a place of like, I just think that this Christianity thing is for somebody else. It doesn't seem like it's for me. That's how I had several years of my life where I felt like I had taken a good look at what following Jesus was and decided that's for somebody else. And Jesus just kept pursuing me. And I don't know about you, but I have friends and neighbors where I feel like they're just not interested. I was talking to someone this weekend about a workplace and engineering workplace, super rational, and just saying, look, my coworkers just don't care at all about spirituality. They're just not interested. And I think that's exactly what Samaria would have said. We're just not interested in a Jewish Messiah. And yet Jesus stayed focused on them. And so Jesus is patient in his mission. He's patient with us even when we reject him. They did not receive him because his face was set towards Jerusalem. But Jesus kept going. He kept going. All right. So big picture. Jesus is tremendously patient, and he embodies the patience. Now I want to jump into John 8. We don't usually do two texts, but I want to look at a case study in patience and how patience plays out sort of on a one-to-one level. And so we're going to look at the beginning of John 8, a passage we've read before, but not always through the angle of patience. And so let's check this out. But Jesus went to the Mount of Olives, and at dawn he appeared again in the temple courts, where all the people were gathered around him, and he sat down to teach them. And the teachers of the law and the Pharisees brought in a woman caught in adultery. They made her stand up before the group and said to Jesus, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery, and the law of Moses commanded us to stone such women. Now what do you say?" They were using this question as a trap in order to have a basis for accusing him. But Jesus bent down and started to write on the ground with his finger, and when they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, "Let any of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." And again he stooped down and wrote on the ground. At this, those who heard began to go away one at a time, the older ones first, until Jesus was left with the woman still standing there. Jesus straightened up and asked her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" "No one, sir," she said. "Then neither do I condemn you." Jesus declared, "Go now and leave your life of sin." All right, I want to look at sort of three things here, three ways that patience is transformative. And I want to begin with the crowd. I think the easy way, when I've read this passage over the years, I almost always side either with Jesus or the woman. The crowd just seems like the bad guys, doesn't it? And to me, I always think of the crowd, the critics here, the moral police as the bad guys. But notice how the patience of Jesus transforms their hypocrisy. Patience transforms hypocrisy. But when Jesus bent down and started to write on the ground with his finger, they kept on questioning him. And I think it's worth sometimes when we read the Bible pausing and really letting this play out in our head. Imagine a group getting ready to actually stone a woman. And imagine what you might do in that electrically charged situation. Would you want to run in and say this is unjust or protect her or get her out of there? There's all different ways we might respond. Jesus just bends down and starts writing in the dust. He doesn't even say anything. And I imagine that situation got really, really tense. Have you ever been in an awkward moment? Dinner party, awkward moment. What's going to get said next? This is awkward but charged with the threat of death. Really, really tense. And when they kept on questioning him, so there, you have to imagine Jesus bending down and people from the crowd just yelling at him and questioning him. Doesn't she deserve death? She committed adultery. She's been caught. And of course, the man that she was with isn't there. It's a setup. Pressing in, yelling at him. And finally, he stands up. "Let any one of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." And I was thinking this week, how sort of risky an answer is that? What if someone had thrown a stone? He doesn't say this is unjust. He doesn't say you guys are hypocritical. He doesn't call down fire on the critics. He just says, if you're without sin, be the first. I think there's enormous patience. And I think when I see the church in America, we usually see the church in the news when we're not behaving at our best. But this kind of wisdom isn't the stuff we usually read about, is it? Usually when the church is running up against what we perceive as moral failure in the culture, aren't we usually throwing stones? But Jesus just says, let the one of you who's without sin be the first to throw a stone at her. In reading this week, I was reminded of this passage. This is one of my just favorite passages. This is from Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the Gulag Archipelago. If If only it were so simple. If only there were evil people somewhere insidiously committing all the evil deeds, and it were only necessary to separate them from the rest of us and destroy them. But the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being, and who's willing to destroy a piece of his own heart? And I think as I thought about the crowd this week, I thought, the truth is that I'm more hypocritical than I usually think I am. And right when we want the hypocrites to just be shown as wrong, I think it's good to remember, wait a minute, that's me too. That's me too. I was thinking in our culture right now, I actually think there's a lot of what I might call reverse hypocrisy in sort of our circles. And here's what I mean by that. I think in our culture, being judgmental, in San Diego, being judgmental is really uncool, isn't it? It's about as uncool a thing as there is. We live in a PC, embrace everybody, and even Christians, as far as my read on Coast, and even like a lot of nearby churches, most of us are not out and out judgmental. We're in a culture, we're beach, we're like, it doesn't matter what you wear. It doesn't matter, what you think. We're a live and let live. Most cultures have some more overt judgment. San Diego's we're on the laid back end of laid back. But what I think is we're actually not so laid back with ourselves. I think a lot of us have lots of grace for other people and not very much for ourselves. I had a really good talk just around body image with some guys last night. Or yesterday, actually, not last night. And realize we're all laid back, but we're all super critical of ourselves. We're super critical. And that's hypocrisy too, isn't it? There's a lot of us in this room who would absolutely believe God has grace for everybody else in here. And if we did some kind of confessional, you'd be like, no problem. Jesus forgives that. Jesus died for that. And even people, you might be, distant from God, but you might sort of even expect grace in a church. Hopefully. I hope that's true. Maybe not, but hopefully. But a lot of times when we look inside, we're hypocritical. We're very judgmental. The bar is super high. And so we need Jesus' patience with our hypocrisy. We need him to be slow. We need him not to just annihilate us. We need him to be gentle with us. We need him to walk with us because we have deep pockets of hypocrisy. Notice, secondly, if patience transforms hypocrisy, patience also transforms conflict. At this, those who heard began to go away one at a time, the older ones first, until only Jesus was left. And the woman was standing there. As I read this passage, it gave me just a spark of hope, thinking that what we're reading in this passage is not just a moral police against a woman, but we're really reading about a community torn in conflict. And I was thinking about this passage and just reminded, what is the answer for our torn up world? It is truly Jesus. It is truly our patient Lord who moves into places that have intractable, unanswerable conflict in the community. I was listening to the BBC this week in the wake of Manchester, and I listened to sort of Manchester working class people say, we need to just bar the Muslims from our neighborhood. And I listened to Libyans in Manchester saying, this is not who Libyans are. And I didn't know there was a huge Libyan community in Manchester. And there are Libyans saying, we've lived here for generations. This is not what it means to be a Libyan Mancusian, as they say, which was not a phrase that I ever had heard before, a Libyan Mancusian. Like, oh my gosh, that's a new phrase in my vocabulary. But you could just import that to San Diego, couldn't you? Just intractable conflict. I listened to Jeremy Corbyn, the British Labour leader, saying, this is because we've been bombing Libya for years. And then everybody in Britain was like, Jeremy Corbyn needs to be sunk in the ocean. Like, how dare he say this is the Britain's fault when someone explodes a bomb and kills children outside of a concert. And yet from a distance, I thought, well, if you do bomb a country for years, people are liable to get mad. And it was interesting, if that had been said in the U.S., there would have been just as much rage, but hearing it from afar, you're like, actually, that kind of makes sense to me. If you bomb a country for a decade, some young man's going to be upset. That doesn't seem really controversial to me as I heard it in the British context. Hearing it in the British context, like that just seems like there's no other thing that could happen. Then people would get mad. And yet I felt the explosiveness of that. Like all we have to do is translate to the U.S. and I feel the same, just all the inflammatory anger that happened in Britain around that comment felt like, well, that would definitely happen here. All that is to say our world is in these conflicts that we don't even know where to begin. And Jesus moves in patiently transforming until the restoration of the whole community is in view. And it reminded me that, as a church, as we talk about blessing our city, the answers to global conflict are actually just as simple and just as complex as following Jesus in our neighborhood. I really believe that's where we start. So this patience transforms conflict, and then we'll close here. And that's with the woman. Jesus straightened up and asked her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" And notice again just the patience in that reply. He's just embodying the patience of God here. Has no one condemned you? And he's letting her see, you came in here as a woman marginalized, ostracized. You came in here as a woman under the threat of death, and now the whole community has walked away and no one condemns you. So he's calling her attention to the restoration that's just happened. "No one, sir," she said. "Then neither do I condemn you," Jesus declared. "Go now and leave your life of sin." His patience transforms our brokenness. Biblical word for that is our sin. Jesus transforms us when we're caught. I said that Jeff's icebreaker question at the retreat was really that easy to answer intro. Who are you and your core identity? So the icebreaker question for the next breakfast, this is an advertisement for the next men's retreat actually. The breakfast icebreaker question Saturday morning was, if people looked into your life and saw your deepest brokenness, what would you be afraid that they see? So just talk about that. So I got my oatmeal. People look into my life. I feel really good answering that over oatmeal and retreat, mass-produced sausage and eggs. It's a perfect combination, industrially cooked sausage. And what's my deepest brokenness? Like, what's the thing I'm most scared of in the whole world that people would see? So we're all trying to answer that, and everybody's kind of choking. And like, how do you wade into that? Do you go light? Like, it's kind of like, lust-ish, or over that way, or fear-ish, or it's kind of got the pride thing. But nobody wants to really this is the thing I'm most terrified in life to give you a window into. For this woman, it's like on a flag. Then we went out for like an hour into the woods, and I was on a walk in the woods, and I saw a tree that had been struck by lightning. And we were asked to just kind of find a spot and do some business with God. So I was out in the woods, and I'd given, some answer over breakfast, which I won't share in a group this large because I'm terrified. But standing in front of the tree, I started thinking about death. And this tree that had been struck and killed and kind of new grass around it. And I realized as I sort of turned the corner, whatever the second half of life is, I saw the dead tree and realized, I think I'm scared of death. I think I'm scared of that. I think some of these other fears, I've always thought of myself as not scared of death, and then I'm just praying, Lord, what do you want to say? And I just felt the Spirit saying to me, you're scared of death. And then I'm like, no, I'm not. I'm actually not. I've kind of always prided myself on being a person who's not really afraid of death. And just, have you ever had God whisper something to you, and then you just like, no? It's like, no, I'm not scared of death. And sort of the Lord, yes, you are. And then I kind of was quiet for a while. I thought about some other things. I read the Bible. A good way to get out of prayer is reading the Bible, actually. If you're ever nervous in prayer, you can read the Bible. I'm partly joking, but partly not. Sometimes it's an escape for me, right? Like, okay. And then I come back out to read a few Bible verses. Okay, well, Lord, what would you want to say to me? And it just felt like the Lord say, you're scared of death. Well, that's why I read the Bible, was like to get out of this conversation. But the Lord just brought me right back there. Right back there. And then I just spent some time. Okay, Lord, here I am. Here I am. Would you transform me? Would you help me have trust for all of life, including the end of life? Would you take my brokenness, which I have all these other brokennesses, which I'm so comfortable. I've dealt with God so much on other areas of brokenness, and then it feels like, well, this is one I don't remember dealing with in this way. Jesus is patient with us. He's patient when we're terrified. He's patient when we're messing up. He's patient with a woman who we don't even know what actually happened, but was accused of committing adultery. And clearly Jesus is telling her, leave her life of sin, so something was going on there. He's patient with her. We all need his patience. And this morning I want to just finish by asking, where do you need the patience of Jesus most? Where do you need that? Because we follow a patient Lord. We follow a Lord who's patient with hypocrisy. We follow a Lord who's patient when we don't get it, and when we don't get it, and when we don't get it. We follow a Lord who's patient when we say, I don't need you, and I'm not interested, and I think you're for somebody else. And then he just comes right back around and keeps pursuing us. We follow a Lord who's patient when we do the very things we hope that most we would never do. Let's all stand. Worship team, if you guys want to come on up, we're going to close with a song and then have a time for prayer. Just before we worship, let's just take a minute, and I want you to think of times that God has been patient with you. And even if you're not a Christian this morning, you could think about that and you may come up with an answer. Just think about, when has God been patient with me? Memories come up there. You can just hold them in your mind for a few minutes or just a few seconds even. And now as we worship, just want you to be asking yourself, where do I need Jesus' patience the most right now? Let's worship. If I could get the prayer team to come on up, or people trained to pray. We'd love to have people up front ready to pray. And I just want to return to that question, where do you need the patience of Jesus most? It's a morning where, as Mary Ann said, we have full access to the God who made us. We have full access. We have full access in our brokenness. We have full access where we're hard on ourselves. Full access even when, like the disciples, were really scared to come to Jesus with a question. Full access. Let's hold hands across the aisles. We do this each week as a reminder that we are a community. We're a community growing in patience. We're a community learning to trust Jesus. We're learning together that we have full access when we're scared, when we're apathetic, when we're disillusioned. We have full access. So, Lord, would you pour out your Spirit on us? Lord, would you sow into us your own character? Would you cause us to be a people of unusual and amazing patience, Lord? Strange patience. Would you cause us to stand out in a hurried world by our steady commitment to you? By the rootedness of our lives in the life of your kingdom. Lord, would you help us to just embody your joy and your generosity on this Memorial Day? We love you, Jesus, and we go out in your name. Amen. If you'd like prayer for anything at all, you could come on up. You're needing patience in a specific way, we'd love to pray with you. And really did think that fear point that Sterling mentioned is something that God wants to press into this morning. And if you're headed out, have a fantastic weekend.